Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
And the idea of communication for phatic communication is not that it's transferring information, but how it's almost content agnostic in that it doesn't really matter what you share. It's the fact that you're sharing.
Hello, humans! How do check-ins, social posts, pictures, and everything we share shape everyday life? And what do they reveal about who we are, how we relate to one another, and even how we experience time? Today on the Tech Humanist Show, I'm joined by Lee Humphreys, professor and chair of the Department of Communication at Cornell University. Lee's work examines how communication technologies become woven into the fabric of daily life, from early mobile phones to today's social platforms and location-based services. She's the author of The Qualified Self, Social Media and the Accounting of Everyday Life, from MIT Press, which offers a powerful reframing of social media. Rather than treating our posts and check-ins as evidence of a suddenly narcissistic culture, Lee shows how people have been documenting and sharing the details of their lives for centuries through diaries, photo albums, baby books, and more. What's new, she argues, isn't the human impulse to chronicle everyday life, but the way these ordinary traces have become data to be mined, monetized, and used for surveillance and profiling. Her work helps us see social media in historical context and think more clearly about what's truly at stake in today's media environment. This is so fun. Lee Humphreys, welcome to the Tech Humanist Show.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. Now, my producer, Lou Diamond, has talked to you on his show, and he's been telling me for a while, like, you guys have got to talk. And it's so funny. In preparing for this and just reading up on your background, I'm like, I actually think we might be, sisters from another mister. Like, we really have so much in common. This is going to be fun.
Indeed.
In fact, for folks who may be listening on audio and not watching the video, you will not know this, but we actually both have a whiteboard in our background, which so even down to the detail of that. But you are a really prominent communication technology expert, and I want to know when you think about that, what first drew you to studying communication and or technology, or the intersection of those?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I guess initially got me interested in it was I took this photography class when I was in college. And one of the things that I was learning was about how to develop photos, in the darkroom, and that process of developing film and then printing pictures. And at the time, and this will tell you how old I am, the O.J. Simpson trial was happening, and there was this pretty large debate at the time about the cover of Time and Newsweek. Both showed his mugshot photo, same exact photo, but one he was significantly darker than the other. And so the question was it manipulated? Can we, trust pictures and images? And this was really, in the 90s, and it was the advent of digital photography and was becoming, more and more popular. And these questions around Photoshop and can we trust what we believe? And so I, at the time, did an undergrad honors thesis on photo manipulation because I was really interested in this idea that all of a sudden, because it's digital, we can't trust it, when we know, political figures, historical figures have been manipulating photography ever since, its advent, even in the 19th century. And so this idea of well, why, when it's digital, do we get really concerned about these issues when they've been around in the analog world for a really long time? And so it got to me thinking about this inherent distrust of new technologies, things that we're unfamiliar with, things that we don't quite understand how they work. Um, and as well as, questions around what can we trust, who can we trust, how do we understand and come to know the world around us.
Yeah, it's so funny that your setup is around photography and film and all that because now there's this whole other angle of my husband is a portrait photographer and working on his second book, which happens to be about the return of film photography as an interest in the world. So it all comes together. You're bringing it all together, Lee.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
Excellent, excellent. Well, does this take us into, the quantified self and the media accounting? Like, is there a straight line or a dotted line from that thinking into the sort of accounting for your days and your lives?
Yeah, for me, it was a very clear line that, of course, often in life, we only see the line when we look back. At the time, we have to struggle through and make our own way. But in retrospect, we're like, oh, yeah, I have been interested in this in a while. So my part of my work eventually, I left photography and I went and I worked at the in the internet.com era stuff, and I became really interested in the differences between the ways people use technology and incorporate it into their everyday lives, and then sometimes the ways that engineers design or marketers market technologies. And sometimes they're very overlapped, and sometimes there are huge disconnects between them. But my work started, I've always been interested in phones, like mobile phones and public phones, um, and so I started to get into early on questions of social media, and in particular Twitter, which was the first mobile phone based social
R.I.P.
media
Twitter.
platform way back, right? And so when I was looking at that, again, I was thinking about how is it that we understand what this technology is and how people are using it. And at the time, again, this will date me as well, they called it a microblog. And so then I started looking into the blogging literature and live journaling and all of these kinds of things that we were trying to understand what this new social platform was really enabling. And so one of the things I did is I compared the ways that people were using Twitter early on to the ways in particular that women in the 19th century were using these things called pocket diaries. And pocket diaries were journals that were small. And so when you make them small, you often make them portable or mobile. So women could tuck them in the waistband of their skirt, or men could put them in their pockets, hence their pocket journals. And the idea was that they were quite a bit smaller in size. And so rather than waiting till you got home at the end of the day to write something down, you could jot it down throughout the day. And it turned out people actually really loved having smaller pieces of paper to write on. And so I equated that to thinking about Twitter and how, blogging allowed us to have unlimited space, which is amazing, but also kind of intimidating. And when you purposefully limit people, that kind of constraint can in some ways be really freeing. And so I think about it, the distinction between no one ever gets stressed sitting down at a Post-it note, right? Like it's pretty easy, like, oh, let me just jot this down, right? Whereas, when my students sit down to a blank Word doc, it's like, oh, I have to fill up the whole page. And so I think one of the ways that we could understand the rise of Twitter and what people were doing on Twitter, which is often talking about themselves and their communities, is actually very similar to the way that these women would write in their journals, that they would not just write about themselves, they would write about their friends and their social networks and their families. And they would write them down in little snippets. And then when people would visit, they would share. They would sit down and go through their journal together, or they would mail their journal to their parents, right? So something that we that I at least thought of as a very private practice of like writing in your journal and then locking it was in fact not at all the way people use journals in, really in the 19th century. They were much more social chronicles of activities and events and things very similar to the early uses of social media.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you are talking about that as the kind of framing origin because I've recently finished reading The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Have you read this by Roland
No, no.
Allen?
Yeah.
So it is an exploration of, the origin story of the notebook and how it came to be. And yeah, there's a whole chapter of the use of like these small pocket notebooks by fashionable women in England and Paris and so on. And it is really interesting because it is so many chapters in after notebooks have already been in place, the commonplaces and the zibaldones and all these
Mhm.
different kinds of notebooks that made their way throughout the previous centuries. But it took us a while, it took people a while to realize that they could, as you say, sort of document just a few little things and share them. And even the commonplaces, I think I got the impression people were capturing little quotes that interested them or,
Mhm.
things that they had observed or whatever. And these would become, as the name suggests, commonplace. They would become things that you could share in common with other people. I think that's a really interesting parallel to draw to something like Twitter, where there is an understood, or even LiveJournal, as you say, like this understood kind of community to the immediacy of sharing a thought. What a great provocation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the early arguments was really to push back on this idea that social media was facilitating narcissism,
Hmm, hmm.
and and it's one of those things that when you think about sharing intimate or even mundane details of one's life, this is how we reinforce our social relations with people, right? And so within the field of communication, we call it phatic communication,
Yeah.
Phatic. And the idea of communication in for phatic communication is not that it's transferring information, but how it's almost content agnostic in
Hmm.
that it doesn't really matter what you share. It's the fact that you're sharing. So
Yeah.
when I call my dad and I say, Dad, what did you have for dinner last
Hmm.
night? Right? I don't really care that he had pot roast, right? But it's around sharing these intimate details is really one of the ways that we show each other that we care and love each other, right?
Yeah. Creating that rapport, creating the connection.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, see, phatic communication. Like how many guests could I have on the show who would bring phatic communication into the discussion? Now let's go though to you. You traced a trajectory from that to like location-based check-ins and geomedia and sensor-mediated communication.
Mhm.
Talk to us about that shift.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that became really interesting to me it started with Twitter, but some of my other location-based networks or technologies, whether it be Snapchat or even geolocating a tweet or an Instagram post. Again, these ideas that it feels very weird to share your location with people and that it's very concerning and it's almost by definition, a privacy infraction or that you're not thinking through things all the way. And so part of what I was trying to do is, again, understand why do people do this, right? And one of the things that became really interesting to me is that there's a variety of reasons why people shared their locations. One of which was all about this idea of identity work, that I can tell you who I am as a person by telling you where I am,
Hmm.
right? So one of the things I found is that, the participants would not share their location when they were at McDonald's or the grocery store. They
Right.
share it when they're at the cool bar or the new restaurant or that concert, right? Because
The
in
architecting of your aspirational self
yes,
through the
exactly.
check-ins. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's also, I mean, not to make it so artificial or performative, right? In so much as if you are excited about something you've done, you would share it with someone that you care about, right? And so I think one of the things that happened is it's very easy to put a cynical lens on sharing things like, oh, I only share when I'm on vacation. I don't share when I'm going to work. Well, that's because the people I know already know that I'm going to work. And
Hmm.
there's something really fun about when you document something, you're more likely to remember it, right? So there was a huge rise in travel journals, right? Because you don't want to forget everything that you're experiencing, right? And so one of the things that we know is that when people document things, whether it be the first day of school or a trip or a vacation with the family, that by documenting it, you also, it sort of helps you to remember it as well. And so I think one of the things that we see with location sharing or other kinds of aspects that yes, it can be related to who I want others to understand me as and that identity work. But it's also, I don't necessarily want to think of my life as me, unloading the dishwasher and doing laundry and all the things that we have to do, right? But like, I am more than that. I am the person who gets to go to this cool concert, and I am, and it's as much for me and my own sense of who I am as it is for other people.
How do you think about that identity work and the creation of that cobbled together self in public with the sort of parasocial relationships that we build along the way?
Yeah, so um within our lives, right? We all have various roles to play, right? So I am a professor, I am a mother, I am a daughter, I'm a best friend from college, right? I am all of these people. And typically, when I am offline, I get to be all these people to different audiences. But online, it's this idea of context collapse that who I am to my student is not who I am to my kids, and that's good. um, and yet online it all gets conflated, and so I think it does lead to some aspects of trickiness in terms of, right, like I don't want I don't want my colleagues to necessarily see me on I don't know, Saturday morning in my yoga pants vacuuming, right? Like there's certain things
No
that
one needs that.
no one needs to see
Exactly.
that, right? No. Or just like I don't need to see photos of my students on a Thursday night drinking, right? Like I don't need to
No one
see
needs
that
that.
either, right? Um, and yet sometimes we do have this context collapse online where we see this. And so I think that can and has led to a kind of limiting either of the audiences. So we make it private, we do different things, or we change the content such that it's agnostic enough that it's not going to offend anybody, right? But it gives a very kind of surface level understanding of who I am and what I do. When it comes to questions of, watching influencers or seeing these kinds of uh, actors or influencers online, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is this sense of intimacy by spending a lot of time with them without necessarily thinking through the fact that social media has become increasingly commodified, such that I think sometimes people go into it assuming authenticity, right? These are real people, and they are, but there are really important economic and financial pressures that I think shape the kinds of content that they share.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I'm thinking about is, so much of your work and mine in different ways uh, ask about what happens when places and experiences get mined through data, right? So when sensors and platforms are part of how we mediate our sense of where we are and what's happening in those spaces, like how do you think about actually sort of defining reality in those spaces, or whose perspectives are shaping that reality and who are dropping out of the picture?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the exercises I would do with my students was to have them look at their phones and look at the maps of where they had
Hmm.
been. And one of the interesting things, and this gets to what it means, like our datafied selves, right? Um, and in particular, when the data do not match our sense of self. And so the perfect example, again, with my students is, we had class and it said that the student had already been to the bar that day. And I said, wow, you've already, like, wow, it's an 11 a.m. class and you have already been to the bar. But the reason is because the data showed it. They had been there until 1 in the morning the night
Oh, yeah.
before, right? And so 1 in the morning is in their head, it's the previous night. But in terms of data, right, it was that day. And so it became this really interesting conversation around how data might misrepresent, again, both our lived experience, but how we could imagine that data could be used in ways that are really unintended, right? And so I think, one of these, so time is an interesting thing as it comes down to, and time and location, right, often go together because we can't think about space without thinking about the when of it,
Hmm.
because we know that space dramatically changes depending on when you're there,
Hmm.
whether it be a park or a concert or an event or, a state of mind. All of these things change. And it can be really hard to capture that in these kinds of longitude and latitude and temporal frameworks, which are very rigid and not at all about people's lived
Yeah, the
experiences.
layer of experience that's
Yeah.
happening in that moment, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so one of the things that we talk about, for example, are different holidays and how some holidays are tied to the calendar, right? So, like Christmas, 4th of July, Valentine's Day tied to the calendar, but things like the first day of school or Easter or like Labor Day, Memorial Day, all of these things change, right, depending on the calendar. And so it becomes these interesting moments where you're like, oh, but that's not today, right? And yet it was that date, that year, and these ideas around how places will dramatically change around holidays and other major events become really hard to then datafy in ways that become really like you just see how starkly it doesn't work when you compare like, oh, 5 years ago at Christmas you were here and then Easter didn't work at all, right? And so it
Yeah.
becomes these interesting moments around looking back and looking forward around people and places and how we understand them so differently over time.
Yeah, it also seems like a nice segue into thinking about the network effect of something like privacy, right? If your experience is connected with other people's experiences and they're tagging and you're tagging, that there is kind of a, you've written that privacy, networked privacy can't just be an individual responsibility, that you're emphasizing structural and contextual factors. So for listeners who still think of privacy as like adjusting your settings, how would you explain what network privacy really is and why that sort of larger structural piece matters so much?
Yeah, I think the idea behind networked privacy is understanding that we are all socially connected in different kinds of ways at different kinds of levels. So we are connected through various kinds of institutions. So whether it be the schools that my kids go to and the sports that they do or the activities that they do, or it might be the organization that I work at, right? And so the organization, so I work at Cornell University, and to some degree, we need to make ourselves visible to other Cornell University employees and staff members and students. And and yet, I don't need to be made visible, right? Does my office number need to be made visible to the general public or just the people who might need to come here? And what does it mean to have my office number on our website publicly available, but then my colleague next door who does research on race and I don't know, queer communities online who might be targeted in different ways because of their research topic. And yet, if you know where I am, you're going to be able to figure out where the professor next to me is, right? And so I think it becomes this really interesting way of thinking about how we have different kinds of responsibilities, both to ourselves, to our families, to our communities, to our colleagues and coworkers, to think about how when we do something or publicize something or think about something in an online environment that and share something that is seemingly not a big deal, how it can become a big deal for different members in different at different levels of risk. And so I think for me, that has become something, again, particularly important as we think about youth, as we think about social gatherings and whatnot. We often want to, again, take pictures and hold on to these wonderful moments. And yet there are really important broader privacy implications that we might not really even be thinking about.
And it sounds like, you're also connecting the dots there to harassment and academic freedom, it sounds like, and especially for scholars from marginalized communities. So what do you think institutions and platforms maybe still not quite getting right about those harms, and what would a more serious structural response look like in practice?
I mean, I think it comes down to policy because right now the platforms have very few incentives. And the only incentives that they really have right now are economic ones, which are really profound, being, publicly traded companies, the majority of them are, or are on the path to becoming publicly traded companies, right? And so that economic incentive to continue to grow revenue over time, I think really shapes the kinds of incentives that they have. And I think, this is where we need to think really carefully about the role of public policy in helping to shape what the practices are. So I know, right now in Australia, I have colleagues who are studying, no cell phones, no social media, under the age of 18. And I don't think bans are the way to go because for some youth, this is their only connection to people who might be like them, to supportive environments, to different kinds of levels of support. And so I'm personally not a fan of bans. I think cell phone bans in schools are fine, right? But because they're supposed to be at school, right? But I do think being really thoughtful about how we think about who has access to different kinds of data and whose data are, right. If I'm connected to someone who then shares their data quite openly, then I'm impacted anytime they repost something or see something of mine, right? It's all connected. And so I think I personally would love to see perhaps a paid model as opposed to an ad-based model, because I think the ad-based model for most of these incentivizes, again, growth, more targeting, et cetera. And I think it would really change the nature of the environment if people could pay for what they want.
Yeah, and it seems like another great segue that sort of lines us right up to thinking about, aligned incentives and taking it back to the sort of composite self that's created through all these check-ins and so on. You've also explored how platforms generate algorithmic identities from our
Mhm.
traces, our posts, locations, connections, and sensor data. When you think about that process, and as an AI systems increasingly act on these inferred identities, deciding what we see, what offers we get, what risks we're said to pose, how does your idea of the qualified self help us think about agency and accountability in these platforms?
Yeah, I think the idea is behind the qualified self is that we have always used technology broadly defined to help us understand who we are. And part of it is our inability to really understand change, right? So we have, lots of, this is why we take so many pictures of children, because in part we know that they're growing and changing every day. And sometimes I swear my son grows like a half an inch overnight, but we use photographs because honestly, in our lived experience, we can't really see change. That it's only in sort of the juxtaposition, the before and after, the this and then, can we see change. And so I think one of the things that we have, and I think we've always used media technologies to do this, whether it be journals or photographs or family albums and whatnot.
Or drawing a line on the wall,
Or
even.
dry, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, exactly. On this date, at this age, he was this tall. Yes, we have that. We love that. Um, and I think, one of the things that becomes really interesting in the platformized mobile media, always have our phones on us and our smartwatches, right? Is that it does help us to see things that we can't, right? Like this idea of my heart rate or how many steps I walked. How many steps did I walk? Do I need 6,000, 10,000? We went to Disney and I walked 25, right? Thousand. So, but this idea of that we can't make systemic change without being able to document where we are now, right? And that if we want to lose weight, if we want to save money to buy a house, we need to be more aware and conscious of making different choices. And so I think we can do this in really wonderful and powerful ways through these technologies. And I think we have always done this with, photographs and journals and whatnot to help us see things that we can't in our lived experience. And so I think that's a really wonderful and powerful thing. That we use media technologies for. I think what becomes problematic and challenging in the contemporary environment is when different companies are, again, offering different opportunities to different people based both on their choices that they make, but also on a host of other data that they don't have access to and they don't really know about or understand. And so I think this notion of data transparency and knowing what data is out there about you and being able to control, because sometimes it's wrong. I didn't go to the bar this morning,
Right.
right? Like it might say I did, but I really didn't, right? And so I think that notion of transparency and correction and context is a really important element as we think about different people and data and how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's ever researched a thing to give as a gift for someone else and then suddenly gotten ads for that thing and competitors to that thing for the next several weeks knows exactly what you're talking about.
Yes,
They know the
yes.
1 a.m. bar phenomenon
Right,
in that
right. Yeah. No,
context.
I don't. I'm not actually looking for that Disney princess thing. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Also, I'm wondering about, I know you've written about maybe more pandemic era. You wrote about how platforms like Zoom became sites for ritual communication during the pandemic. But what did we learn about the kinds of rituals that digital spaces can support? And especially thinking forward to the discourse that's ongoing about the future of work and return to office and remote work and things like that. What do we know now that we didn't know pre-pandemic?
That's such a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that often gets overlooked are these kinds of mundane technologies which we become so reliant on. So I think Zoom is one of these platforms that, for instance, I'm in the office and yet I'm on Zooms all day, right? And so does it matter that I'm in the office if I'm on Zooms all day? Probably not, right? And so I think what becomes this really interesting moment is, and I think there's a lot of things we can do on Zoom, right? Like, I don't know, I had a weekly game, my husband and I had a weekly game night with
Nice.
friends where we did that. Even now, you know what, my dad is 83 and we play Ticket to Ride. And he sets up a Ticket to Ride board on his kitchen table, and we do it on our table. And it's like so old school, but it's like facilitated through Zoom. And it's like a Sunday afternoon, we can play Ticket to Ride together. And it's just to say, like, it would be better if we could do it together in person. But he lives 3 hours away, and I don't want him driving that far, right? And so I think what we've learned is that there are technologies that, like Zoom, for instance, that can facilitate remote interaction and access in ways that are better than just a telephone call, right? Um, and it also has helped us to understand when it's important to be in person, right? There are certain kinds of conversations that are more likely, right? The chit chat that happens before a meeting starts doesn't happen on Zoom, right? It happens in a conference room when you have 20 people all sitting down getting settled, right? With someone setting up the Zoom, right? For the four people who have to be remote. So it's just to say that like, and I getting back to this phatic communication, that
I was trying to
idea,
bring you back to
I was
it.
going to say, I'm going to come back to it. But this idea of like, what do those conversations at the start and end of meetings do, right?
Mhm.
They reinforce social connection. They show that work is not merely transactional, that we are part of communities. And like when I ask you, what'd you do this weekend? Right? Oh, it's Father's Day, whatever. Like, it helps us to feel more than just employees, right? It helps us to feel like people. And I think that that's really important for the nature of work. That we are looking for more than just being an employee. We want to be seen. We want opportunities to advance. We want to understand and support employees where they are in their lives, in their careers, in their families. So I think we learned a lot about Zoom and 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 what can be
And
remote
sourdough
and
and yeah.
sourdough, and I got super into CrossFit
Oh, there you
and
go.
right, like all of these different things, and what it means to co-watch TV together,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But to your point, it sounds like there's, again, just like you talked about a moment ago with the algorithmic identities, it's so much about this intentionality, right? About being thoughtful and mindful about what kind of sort of structure you're creating,
Yeah,
what you're reinforcing, and that sort of thing. Yet at the same time, clearly, and it's no surprise to anyone listening, I'm sure, that there is also this kind of systemic piece that needs to be thought through, like what are the structures reinforcing, what are the incentives kind of reinforcing, and those two tensions are not mutually exclusive, right? Like, we have to
mhm,
be thinking at that systemic level, like what
yeah,
are the policies supporting, and also like how we mindfully show up in these
yeah.
systems, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think this notion that it is both and, right? It is immensely complicated and it takes away from our humanities in some ways, but it so often facilitates social connection and meaning. It's, I'm never someone to say, oh, it's all bad. But as a communication researcher, what I want to do is to maximize the benefits of technology in society and minimize the detriments. And so I think awareness, reflexivity, being mindful about how and when we use them, is one of the most important things that we can do.
Yeah, well, that's an almost closing thought there, Lee Humphreys. I wonder if we go ahead and let you put a bow on it. Like, as we close, the question we always like to ask on the Tech Humanist Show is, when you think about the current landscape, like what's going on around social media, around the mediated communication, AI, all of it, what is giving you hope right now? Where are you finding reasons to believe that we can build those kinds of systems that are more just, more life affirming, and that can help us show up more mindfully inside them?
I was thinking about this question, and I don't know if this is really the bow, but I'll just say that, recently, my husband was in a bad bicycling accident, and so I used social media and honestly Google Sheets to set up a meal train.
Oh yeah.
And now that he's doing better, I've set up a walk with my husband's name is Jeff, so it's a walk with Jeff schedule. And this is one thing he can do right now is go for walks. And so, but what he misses is people, right?
Yeah.
He misses people. And so I don't think anyone at Google thought that I would be setting up a walk with Jeff in a Google Sheet and being able to send it out to, friends and colleagues to do this really small but incredibly meaningful thing. And so I guess my hope is for, in tragedy, we innovate and we connect. And sometimes we use technology to connect in person. Sometimes we use technology to just send a text to say, hey, I'm thinking about you. And these really small things are still so incredibly meaningful and reinforce community in really powerful ways. So I am hopeful because, people will continue to innovate in small and big ways. And I think they will do so in ways that help them, their families, and their communities.
Wow. That was a perfect bow. And people can be having communication that is both deep and profound and phatic as well, right?
Indeed, indeed.
Lee Humphreys, thank you so much for joining us on the Tech Humanist Show.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to The Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interrobang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to The Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.